Welcome. I'm Jan Ozer. Thanks for coming to this fourth webinar in this series, Setting Bitrate Control and Keyframe Parameters. A lot of the information from this webinar is derived from this book. If you need some more information about these topics or about any other compression-related topics, check out Producing Streaming Video for Multiple Screen Delivery at the bit.ly URL shown on this page. As an overview, I'm thinking this presentation will take about 30 minutes. That'll leave us up to 30 minutes for question and answers if there's that many questions. You should be watching on the YouTube page with comments available. Please ask any questions in the comments area. My contact information is on the front page. So if you want to call me or send me an email after the presentation, please feel free to do so. And if you don't have the handouts, if you didn't get an email this morning with the handout, they are available at the URL shown on this page, the bit.ly keyframe_webinar URL. Click over there, you can download the handout. You can watch it on that page, but I think you get more functionality if you watch it on YouTube because you can add comments. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between single file and adaptive delivery because that's key to both setting keyframe parameters and choosing a bitrate control technique. So we'll start there, and then we'll look at the bitrate control alternatives. We'll talk about what VBR is and how it differs from CBR. And then we'll talk about how to optimize the encoding parameters for each in typical encoding programs that you'll be using to produce these kind of files. Then we'll look at keyframes. We'll talk about what a keyframe is, how to choose a keyframe interval, how to configure other keyframe parameters for both single file and adaptive streaming. And then we'll spend just a minute or two on IDR frames so you understand the difference between an IDR and a keyframe, and also how to set those parameters in your encoding program. Okay, so when I produce a single file, I'm producing a single file that I'm going to distribute to all my streaming viewers. And my key focus there is stream quality. So when I set bitrate control and keyframe parameters, I only care about quality. Now, when I'm producing for adaptive delivery, I'm producing multiple files from the same source. And the files get switched dynamically based upon the bandwidth to the video player, based upon the CPU in the video player, and other characteristics. There I care about quality, but my key focus is stream switchability and consistent delivery. So if you're delivering via adaptive streams with technologies like HLS, HTTP live streaming, Adobe's dynamic streaming, whether HTTP or RTMP, whether Microsoft Smooth Streaming or Dash, you need to use different bitrate control parameters and different keyframe settings than you would for a single file. And we'll cover those in the respective areas. Okay, here's our mini agenda for the bitrate control. We'll talk about what the two alternatives are and how they differ, how they differ for both single file and adaptive delivery, and then when to use each. And then we'll take a quick look at a technology called CQ or CRF, something some of you may be familiar with. It's not typically used in streaming, but I wanted to just touch on it so there wouldn't be any confusion about it. Okay, so what's the difference between VBR and CBR? We're going to talk about this for the next few frames within the context of a single video file that's got different sequences that contain different amounts of motion. And motion, as you undoubtedly know, makes a video file harder to compress. So this particular file starts out with very low motion, and then it moves to moderate motion, a woman making a pita. Then it goes back to low motion, a chip grinding machine. Moderate motion, a gentleman playing the violin, and then high motion, me walking down the street with a camera on my chest, basically just taking video of the street as I pass it by. So different levels of motion in the file. A constant bitrate encoded file will encode the same, we'll use the same data rate across the entire file. So that's the red dotted line, and you can see that's 500 kilobits per second, irrespective of the content within the video file itself. The VBR file for variable bitrate encoding varies the data rate with scene complexity. So as the video file gets easier to compress, the data rate goes down. As the video file gets harder to compress, the data rate goes up. And we see that in this particular file. We see the low motion sequences around 300 kilobits per second. We see the moderate motion jumps up to over 500. Back to the chip grinding machine, also low motion. Moderate motion for the violin player, and then very high motion towards the end. Now, one of the questions I always ask my live classes is, which file is bigger? So I say, okay, which file is bigger? We'll produce one file with CBR, one file with VBR. Which file is bigger? How many people think it's VBR? Can't see if you're raising your hands or not. The answer is the files are the same. So you should have an average bit rate of 500 kilobits per second, whether you use VBR or CBR. Just wanted to make that point clear. You guys probably already knew that. So this is kind of a synthetic example of what the file would look like. Let's look at an actual example of the video file that was encoded. So this is a program called Bitrate Viewer, and what it shows you is the average bit rate of the video file, and the spikes are keyframes within that video file, and you'll learn more about keyframes in a moment. Now, there's a wavy blue line that shows what the data rate is in the actual file, what the average data rate is. And I'm sorry it's so faint, but you can, if you don't have the handout in front of you, if you haven't downloaded the PDF, I didn't email it to you because you didn't register, you can download it at the URL that I showed a few moments ago. And actually, let me go back to that because some people may have come a little bit later. And okay, so if you don't have the handout, you can get it at bit.ly/keyframe webinar. So let me leave that up for a minute or a few seconds so people can get that. You can download the handout. It's there right now. Okay, so back to our presentation. This is a CBR file, and hopefully on the screen you can see the wavy blue line. It's very consistent irrespective of the content in the file. It varies a little bit. It's not flat line, but you can see that there are some relatively consistent throughout. Now this is the same file encoded using VBR techniques. Now if you take a look at the upper right, you'll see that the average bit rate of this file is around 600 kilobits per second. Okay? Now here's the VBR. Here's the same file encoded using VBR encoding, and you can see the same type of data rate graph that we saw in the synthetic file that I showed a few moments ago. So we see a very low bit rate at the start of the file. It goes up for the women spinning the pita, stays relatively consistent for the chip grinding machine, and then goes up and up and up as the scenes get more complex towards the end of the file. And if you look on the upper right, you'll see that I think the average bit rate for this particular file is 596 kilobits per second. So within 3 or 4 kilobits per second of the CBR file, as I said, you end up with a file that's the same average bit rate, should be the same size. The data rate will vary for VBR, and it won't vary for CBR. Okay, so what do we like about CBR versus VBR? CBR, as we talked about, has one bit rate applied irrespective of the content in the video. The pros, the things we like about it are it's easy to use, it's fast, you can do it in one pass, and if you downloaded the handout, you don't have this red bullet point, which is a consistent stream. There's no data spikes. It's a very easy stream to stream, particularly to remote devices, because there's no spikes in the data. Very smooth stream, very easy to stream. The negative is that it doesn't optimize quality, and we'll look at an example of that in just one frame. It doesn't optimize quality because it doesn't change the bit rate of the video file according to scene complexity. Now I've done a lot of encoding, both CBR and VBR, and I've done a lot of comparisons. This is the absolute most difference I've ever seen in any file that I encoded using CBR and VBR. So on the left we see the CBR encoded file, and we see, now let me explain. This looks like a pretty static scene, but this is a 2-camera shoot. One of the cameras is shooting from top down. This is an artist painting. And the other one is the frontal shot that you're seeing here. This particular frame is right after a transition from the top camera to the straight-on camera. So even though it doesn't look like there's a lot of motion here, there is a lot of motion. On the left we see CBR, on the right we see VBR, and you can see the data rates of the two files beneath that in the frame graph in this program. It's a program called Semaphore, was by Inlet. When they got bought by Cisco, this program kind of went away, but I have a copy of it, and it's pretty useful for precisely this reason. So you see on the left the CBR, the data rate's consistent, the frame is ugly. We see on the right the frame varies, or the data rate varies by scene complexity, and the frame looks better. Now again, this is the biggest difference I've ever seen between CBR and VBR encoded files. Typically you'll see a lot less. But overall, CBR will produce, in some instances, slightly lower visual quality than VBR because the data rate doesn't vary according to scene complexity. Okay, what do we like about VBR? The bitrate matches the motion, so you get the best overall quality. The negatives are you need 2 or more passes to encode the file. The other negative is, and this is an even bigger negative, is the data rate varies with the file. So if you're streaming a file over a limited bitrate connection and the bitrate jumps too high, you could have the stream interrupted. Right? If you're sending to a mobile connection that's only got a very limited bitrate, if the VBR data stream jumps, the video won't get through. So we like the quality, we don't like the stream variability. Okay, how do I produce the best quality CBR? Just a couple of points. This is telestream episode. Obviously, when you're producing a live stream, you don't have the option to use 2-pass VBR, but when 2-pass CBR. But when 2-pass CBR is available, you always want to use it. It takes a little bit longer, but you get the highest possible quality encoded file. If you're encoding for draft or you're encoding live, you always want to use 1-pass CBR. A couple of things about the optimal quality VBR file. Typically, when you're producing for VBR, you definitely need to use 2 passes. 1 pass, the encoder determines where the easy to compress and hard to compress scenes are. The 2nd pass, it actually does the encoding. Some programs like Sorensen Squeeze that you see here gives you an option between 2-pass and multi-pass. And whether you want to do that or not is application dependent. With Sorensen Squeeze, you can take 2 or 3 times as long to encode with multi-pass, and the quality difference just isn't that significant. I've done the test, and the quality difference isn't noticeable. So when I produce with Sorensen Squeeze, I always use 2-pass, not multi-pass. On the other hand, if you're encoding with Apple Compressor, you don't have the option to choose 2-pass. It's all multi-pass or single pass. So, learn your application program, learn what the options are. If you have the option for 2 versus multi, do some test and code, see if there's a difference. With Squeeze, there wasn't. So that's number 1. You've got to use 2-pass, 2 passes or more. Number 2 is when you're encoding for streaming, you have to encode using what's called constrained VBR. And what that does is it constrains the maximum and sometimes the minimum data rate to either a set number or a percentage of the target bit rate. So let's see what that looks like. So on the top, we've got telestream episode. And we've got 2-pass VBR constrained as the selected encoding parameters. And the target bit rate is 500 kilobits per second. And the maximum bit rate is 1 megabits per second, or 1,000 kilobits per second. And here you're basically setting both the target in kilobits per second and the maximum in kilobits per second. On the bottom right, you've got Sorensen Squeeze, and for this particular codec, it gives you the ability to set both the maximum and the minimum, both expressed as percentages of the target bitrate. So, what's my rule of thumb? Typically when I'm encoding for single file streaming, I will use 200% of target as my maximum constraint, 50% of my target for minimum, if that's available. And for adaptive streaming, as the slide suggests, it's just complicated. And let's explore why. Okay, so for adaptive streaming, if you're streaming live, always use CBR. So no issues there. If you're streaming on demand, most experts, most pundits recommend that you use CBR. They say it's a more consistent stream, and you'll have fewer encoding-related stream switches. Now let's talk for a second about what that is. So this is a video file encoded for adaptive delivery, and these are 3 segments, or 3 fragments, or 3 chunks of that video file. And because we used we use variable bitrate delivery, chunk A is an average size, pretty normal scene to compress. Chunk B was a high motion sequence, very hard to compress. So the data rate really jumped during that sequence. And then scene C, this little chunk C over here, is an easy to compress scene, so the data rate's very low. Now, one of the heuristics that the player monitors to determine when to stream switch is the player buffer. So when we send chunk A It gets there fairly quickly because it's normal sized, and we have, in the example, we're showing 5 seconds in the buffer. So life is good. The player won't signal a stream switch. The player won't retrieve a different stream. Then we send chunk B. Chunk B is very large because it's a hard to compress scene, and we use variable bitrate encoding. It takes a long time to deliver that chunk, and the player says, oh my goodness, I've only got 1 second of video left in the buffer. We better switch streams to get a lower quality stream, but continue smooth playback. And that's the risk, the theoretical risk, of encoding with variable bitrate encoding for adaptive delivery. You get encoding-related stream switches. You don't mind when you switch streams because the bandwidth dropped or because the CPU dropped, but you don't want any synthetic stream switches caused simply by the way you chose to encode your files. So that's the theory. And I say theory because I did an article for Streaming Media Magazine a couple years ago, and I spoke to a lot of producers, including MTV, who obviously sends out a lot of streams and a lot of high-quality streams. And they're using 200% constrained VBR for their adaptive bitrate encoding. So obviously they wouldn't do that if that caused lots of problems, but basically every expert you talk to, every white paper that you read says use CBR because what you want to do with adaptive streaming is get to a single bit rate and maintain that bit rate for as long as you can during the life of the stream, because stream switches can interrupt audio, they can interrupt video. You really want to find the best bit rate and then stream that way. If you do variable bit rate encoding, sometimes you can introduce, or I guess in theory, you can introduce these encoding related stream switches. MTV says they don't exist. Other producers feel the same way, but pretty much every white paper that you read says use CBR. So what do I do? What do I recommend? When I do a consulting project, my biggest concern is that the streams switch smoothly. The function works. So what I always use either very, very highly constrained, 125% to 150% VBR, or CBR, and typically it's CBR because I want the system to work. Maybe it's superstitious, but I want it to work smoothly, and later if I want to do some fine tuning, I can do that. But overall, I just don't see that much difference between VBR and CBR, and I'd rather use a technology that I think will do the best job delivering the streams and producing a good experience via adaptive delivery than to risk interrupting all that just for a little bit of extra quality that typically you may or may not see, depending on your source content. Bottom line for me, what I recommend, what I do is CBR or highly constrained VBR when I'm producing for adaptive delivery. So when should I use VBR and CBR? When I'm producing for single file streaming via broadband, I always use constrained VBR. That's 200% for maximum, 50% for minimum. When I'm producing for mobile, mobile connections are not as robust as a broadband connection. So typically, I'll use highly constrained VBR, maybe 125% on the maximum side, or CBR. If I'm producing for progressive delivery, constrained VBR, again, that's the 200%, 50% that we talked about. If I'm producing live, it's CBR all the way. CBR out of the building. When I'm encoding my stream like I am here using Telestream Wirecast, it's set to CBR so it can get smoothly out of my building. When I set up the, if I'm going to re-encode the streams at the streaming server, I'll use CBR there as well. And then if I'm producing for adaptive delivery, then basically, as we discussed, either use highly constrained VBR or CBR. Okay, and what about CQ-CRF? This is Sorensen Squeeze using the X.264 codec. You've got an option to use one-pass CQ, which is constant quality. It's also called CRF, or common rate factor, which you can also see in the user interface for Squeeze below. How this works is you set a quality factor. You say I want a quality of 23, and then the encoder maintains that quality and varies the data rate to produce that. So what you get is you get a lot of really high data spikes if you've got hard to compress sequences within your video. So I know one or two producers of streaming content who use this. They're distributing via progressive download, not via streaming. I prefer to optimize deliverability when I'm producing for streaming, whether it's progressive download or streaming. So I recommend not using CRF except for archiving. I think it's a great technology if you're producing a file, you want the quality to be consistent, but the data rate to be low when it doesn't need to be high. That's when I would consider using CRF, but I would never use it for any kind of streaming delivery. Okay, this slide, I was going to try and cover this, but let's just ignore this and move on. Okay, so now that ends our discussion of bitrate control. Let's move on to IB and P frames. And first we'll talk about what a keyframe is, and I'm going to use that term interchangeably with iframe. So an iframe is a keyframe is an iframe. Different programs show them differently, but understand when I say keyframe, I mean iframe and vice versa. So we'll talk about what a keyframe is. We'll talk about how to choose an interval, how to configure other keyframe-related encoding parameters, including IDR frames. Now, B frames I discussed in an H.264 specific webinar that you can see at that bit.ly URL. And it's H.264 fun for fundamentals, not fun. And if you want to learn about encoding or choosing B-frame parameters for H.264, check out that particular webinar. Okay, so what are IB and P frames? All H.264 files, which is pretty much what we're talking about now, are encoded in what's called a group of pictures. A group of pictures starts with an iframe and continues to the next iframe, but doesn't include that iframe. So a group of pictures is basically from the iframe in a group of pictures until the last frame before the next iframe. Iframes, or keyframes, are encoded totally self-referentially. So it's basically a JPEG file. You don't refer to any other frame for the type of what's the word I'm looking for? You don't refer to any other frame when you're doing the encoding. It's totally self-referential. P frames can look backwards for redundancies. B frames can look backwards and forwards for redundancies. They're more efficient, but they don't have the unique characteristics of keyframes, which we'll talk about in a second. So an iframe, totally self-referential, no searching for redundancies in any other frames. So because it doesn't use any kind of redundancy, it's the largest frame, right? It's pretty much a JPEG frame. That makes it the least efficient frame. So in general, when we're encoding our files for adaptive delivery or single file delivery, we want to have the most compact stream possible because that allows us to get it to our remote viewers. So basically, you want to use as few keyframes as possible and still accomplish the other needs of the file. And we'll cover what those other needs are in a second. Now, historically, when you're encoding for MPEG-2 for both broadcast and DVD, the keyframe interval had to be one keyframe every 1 second of video. So you see a lot of broadcasters who are now streaming video use that one keyframe per second interval. That is not correct. It's suboptimal. So if that's what you're using now, focus in on the next few frames and you'll see why you may want to consider switching that. Okay, so keyframes are large, they're inefficient, so we want to use as few as possible. However, they also aid in interactivity. All playback has to start on a keyframe. So if you've got a viewer who's randomly seeking through a video file that's on their hard disk, or they're doing it via the DVR function in their streaming player, if they land on a P frame or a B frame, then to play the video file, the player has to go back to the immediately preceding iframe and then scan forward. Otherwise, it doesn't have all the information necessary to play that frame. So in the slide, we see to play this frame, the second or the third P frame, to play that file, the player would have to go back to the immediately preceding iframe. Okay, and for that reason, because you don't want that seek and scan forward to take too much time, typically you'd have a maximum keyframe interval of between 5 and 10 seconds. And when I'm producing a file for single file delivery, I use a keyframe interval of 10 seconds. Keyframes also reset quality. If you have a scene change, you want a keyframe at that scene change because you've got the highest possible quality file for all the B frames and the P frames after that file to refer to get redundancies. So whenever you have a scene change, you want your encoder to insert a keyframe there. And different encoding tools have different terms for that. Telestream likes the term natural keyframe. So an episode or some of their Vantage products, you'd say the option for natural keyframes, you'd elect that for single file delivery. Most other programs, including Squeeze, they'll just use, check here for keyframes at scene changes. And for single file delivery, you always want keyframes at scene changes. Now, what about adaptive? The rules change completely, and you're going to want a shorter keyframe interval. And in many instances, you're going to want to disable scene change detection. And let's look at why. So here's kind of a schematic of how adaptive streaming works. We've got 3 file alternatives: alternative 1, alternative 2, and alternative 3. And then we've got, let's say each of these chunks is 3 seconds of video or 6 seconds of video. The streaming encoder will encode these into chunks, and then when you switch streams, because the bandwidth varies, the buffer gets low, the CPU starts getting overheated, then you basically retrieve and play a different chunk in the next file. So we start off playing chunk A in alternative 1. If life is good, we upgrade to chunk B in alternative 2. If life continues to be good and the bit rate, the bandwidth is good, CPU is good, we'll upgrade to chunk C in alternative 3. And that's how all streaming decoders work. So all streaming encoders work. So you need an iframe at the start of every chunk in order to make sure you can play that chunk. So rule number 1 is you want the keyframe interval equal to the chunk size or divisible into the chunk size. And let's look at how that works. This is a presentation in Sorensen Squeeze. They do a nice job of showing how this should work. And here we're seeing, what is the keyframe interval? 2 seconds. What is the fragment or chunk size? And that's 6 seconds. So Squeeze does this automatically for you. If you're producing in another encoding tool, you'll have to do this manually. But rule number 1 is you want a keyframe interval that either matches the fragment duration or is divisible equally into the fragment duration. So every chunk starts on a keyframe. You also need regular keyframes. Now, we talked a minute ago about inserting keyframes at scene changes. Now, some encoding tools, if you inserted a scene change, will reset the keyframe interval. So if the keyframe interval is 90 frames and they find a scene change at 15 frames, then the next automatic keyframe will be 90 frames later. In that case, you won't get a keyframe at the start of every chunk size. So depending on the encoding tool, you want to make sure that you either disable scene change detection, or in a program like Squeeze, you find an option that says fixed iframes distance, and that ensures that you get a keyframe at a regular interval. And a lot of the more advanced cloud encoding tools and a lot of the more advanced high-end encoding tools give you the option to force a keyframe at a regular interval, which is absolutely critical when encoding for adaptive streaming. Now, what about IDR frames? IDR frames are instantaneous decode refresh frames, and you'll see some encoding tools give the ability to set a IDR frame interval. And so there's 2 kinds of keyframes. One is an IDR keyframe where no frame can reference a frame before the keyframe. And then there's non-IDR frames where B frames and P frames can reference frames before that keyframe. And the simple answer is whenever you're encoding for either single file or adaptive streaming, make sure that every keyframe is an IDR frame. And let's look at why for adaptive streaming. Again, if you're doing the stream switch that we saw before, if you have an IDR frame, if you have a keyframe that is not an IDR frame, a frame in that chunk could look for a reference from a file in a previous chunk, and if you switch streams, that chunk isn't there. The chunk was actually from a different stream alternative. So IDR frames can actually break adaptive streaming schemas, and you should never use them when you're encoding for adaptive streaming. And most authorities say if you're producing for even single file streaming, you get more interactivity if you've got all iframes set as IDR frames. General rule for me is anytime I've got this option, I make sure all keyframes are IDR frames. And pretty much for every encoding tool that I've looked at, if you don't have the option to either choose IDR frames or non-IDR frames, they're all IDR frames. So I wouldn't worry about it if you don't see this control. If you do see the control, it's Telestream gives it to you, Rosette gives it to you, then make sure that every keyframe is an IDR frame. What about RTMP dynamic streaming? We talked about HLS, we talked about HDS. Those are all chunk-based adaptive streaming technologies. RTMP-based dynamic streaming is older, it's more mature, but it's still very widely used. It uses multiple files, but no file chunking. The server is in charge of distributing the files to the player as needed. So the player will signal to the server, we need a stream switch, and the server will figure out what chunk to send to the player. The keyframe rules for RTMP-based dynamic streaming are the same. Intervals should be short, 2 or 3 seconds, so you can switch streams nimbly. You typically want to disable scene change detection unless you have a fixed iframe difference for the same reasons. You want regular ability to switch streams. And all keyframes should be IDR frames. OK, that's I'm not seeing. OK, I'm not seeing any questions. I'll wait for a moment to see if any questions appear. Again, you want to send them on your YouTube page. OK, so that's it. We'll have another webinar in a week. We're going to discuss how HTML5 can help you simply and easily stream to both desktops and mobile devices. And until then, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, remember the email and the phone number at the front of this presentation. And thanks for watching.